Today's history walk brings me into the Cumbrian region, across the Scottish border, in a place that's solemn. The weather today is bleak, but so again is the subject matter. For here, in July 1307, an event would change the history of the country. Some for better, some for worse. For Robert the Bruce, this would be an opportune moment. This event was the death of one of the most formidable kings ever to sit, if not the most formidable, ever to sit on the throne of England. The death of King Edward I, Plantagenet of England. If you're coming down here, this is Burgh by Sands, or is very close to the small settlement called Burgh by Sands, and it was a settlement back in the year 1307. But down here on the Solway Coast, Edward had been in Carlisle, and he was preparing. He's 67 years of age now. He is preparing to come north. I'm looking for cattle. So these are cattle lands, cattle grazing lands, and I'm always very careful of being in close proximity to cattle. But Edward had been north, and as always, as was Edward, he wanted to lead this invasion north to put down the Bruce Scots rebellion. Remember, the year before, Robert Bruce had murdered John Comyn of Badenoch. Edward would leave Carlisle. Now, up until then, it was well known that he had been sick, that he was ill, and he'd also been carried to Carlisle in a litter. What Edward wanted to show the leader he was of his men, the great warrior, the battle chief, the strategist, is he donated his litter to the church in Carlisle. And once more he climbed upon his great war horse in a display of leadership and power, and he left Carlisle. But Edward's health would run out. He would travel only 6 miles in 10 days. 6 miles in 10 days before settling here at this part of the coast. One can only imagine that he was planning to sail a little bit more north and re-engage with the rest of his army. But he stopped here on the Solway Coast. And as his attendants were trying to feed him, they got him to rise up, and he died within their arms. This monument, tradition tells us that this is exactly the spot where King Edward left this world, where he breathed his last, and where events significantly afterward would change. It's not difficult to imagine the English army all around here. They must have known, they would have known, that Edward couldn't go on for much longer. Edward, all of his life, had this uncanny knack, in a miraculous way, of avoiding death. As a young boy playing chess, he suddenly got up from the table, walked away, and a stone would fall from the ceiling and land exactly where he'd been sitting. When on crusade, when his scouts brought him news of Baybars, one of them sought audience with King Edward, which he was given. Little did King Edward know that this was an assassin. The assassin had a go at Edward, stabbed him in the arm in the process, but Edward managed to kill the assassin. This is the famous tale where the blade had been poisoned and Edward's wife, Eleanor, sucked the poison out and saved his life. At Stirling, at the siege of Stirling, a javelin was thrown at Edward, unarmed, and landed inches between his feet. His horse was always put down by a missile from a mangonel, one of the siege machines. Edward had an uncanny and almost sinister way of flirting with and avoiding death. It's fitting in many ways that Edward would die on campaign. It's what he did his entire life. Scotland was a thorn in Edward's side. Time and again he thought he had brought it to heel and subdued the land. But there was always a rebel to stir up the trouble and thwart Edward's plans. He felt a great frustration when once and for all he thought he'd finally brought this land under his control, only for Robert the Bruce. It's said that when Robert the Bruce reared his head in rebellion, that Edward went nearly out of his mind. And this might be true, because I've often said that it's very possible that Bruce trained and was raised and brought up in Edward's court. That Edward knew him, that they knew each other, and that Edward had a particular fondness for him. With rebels like William Wallace, you can understand Edward's barbarity once Wallace was captured, and people like Simon Fraser. But I genuinely believe that Edward was hurt at his heart with the rebellion of Robert Bruce. So lying here on his deathbed, contemplating the trip north to bring Bruce down, Edward must have known that his strength was nearly spent. What would the English do? What would the army do when Edward passed away? We know that Edward was a great leader, a warrior. But some part of Edward's character was questionable. On one occasion, when he was a young prince, a youth had offended him somehow. And Edward had ordered members of his entourage to cut off an ear and gouge out an eyeball. A streak of cruelty, of sadistic pleasure in a young prince for a man that would be king. It's well known, Edward's temper, that famous Plantagenet rage. In 1296, when his army surrounded the town of Burgh, they insulted Edward from the castle battlements and walls. They even bared their buttocks to him. But when Edward breached those walls, it would be the blackest day in Scottish history, as his men created havoc and ran through that town with murderous intent, putting all men, women and children to the sword. Edward was compared to the leopard. So if you split that word into Leo, the lion, Edward was compared to a lion because of his courage and his ferociousness, which he possessed. Of that there's no doubt. The Latin pardus comes from panther-like. One chronicler said that as a lion, he has pride in his ferociousness, but as a panther, he has inconstancy in his changeableness. Edward would clothe himself and talk to people in pleasant words, but if he was in a tight spot, but as soon as he had escaped from a tight spot, or he had an ulterior motive, his promise meant nothing. His word was gone. And no one knew that more. The Scots were to experience that at the crowning of King John Balliol, when Edward was presiding over that at Norham. Edward would not be long, because shortly thereafter he would humiliate Balliol. He would strip him of his kingship. And he had used him to his own ends. So how did Edward die? Edward generally, throughout his life, was in fantastic health. He was healthy as a young boy. As a young boy, he was described as having very light blonde golden hair. That would darken as he got older. When he was in his old age, it said that his hair was white as a swan. He developed a complaint later on in life that one of the writers describe as dysentery. A bloody flux. So this is the passage of blood and mucus within his stools, which clear signs really of cancer of the rectum, bowel cancer. And there is no description of him having fever or vomiting. That Edward would succumb to cancer at 67 years of age. Now, he's lived longer than any other English king. His wish was that one writer tells us this, that his bones should be boiled from his flesh and his bones carried north against his enemies. I always believe that King Edward I was at pains leaving his legacy, his work, the responsibility of his country in the hands of his son, who was a different kettle of fish. when King Edward passed here on 6th of July 1307, his flesh was not boiled from his bones. No, the army did not go north either. Edward would be taken to the nearby church of St. Michael's. Shortly thereafter, Edward II would be declared King of England in Carlisle. But the army would not go north this time against the Bruce. They would go south, homewards, and give Robert the Bruce valuable time for his next moves. If you have strong powers of visualization, take a walk down there. Take a walk down there to the coast. Put your boots on, for you will surely get mucky. But standing down there, there are many places, castles, battlefields, monuments where something happened that give me a real sense of place. Some are a bit more difficult to attain that sense of place than others, but this here, I was last here, goodness me, a late teenager when I was last down here, shocking, but I have been in the area many times, but I do get a strong sense of place here. When I look down there to that monument and to that area where Edward breathed his last, knowing that his army would have brought him somewhere up this road and onward the couple of miles to the local village settlement at the time with news that the king had died and that he would be lying in state in the local church. There's a solemnness down there when you're walking on those sands. You can easily conjure up the moment that had happened. I've read about King Edward all my life. I've been intrigued by him. Scotland's greatest enemy, for sure, but there are many more aspects to Edward's life that make him all the more intriguing. And he's a fascinating character. Anytime I've been down Westminster and I've run my fingers over that black Purbeck marble that inters Edward, thinking about that man inside, it fascinates me, intrigues me even more. In May 1774, King Edward was exhumed, and there's a great description of it, and there's a marvellous drawing. We have a real inclination to what King Edward I looked like. And when we pair that with his personality and his character traits, we get an even deeper insight into the man. And that's fascinating for me. I will include a photo, it's a sketch, it's a drawing of what they found inside, in a body that was really intact, in very good state, with his robes, with his sceptre, and with a crown upon his head. King Edward was brought here to St. Michael's Church in Burgh by Sands. This must have been something astonishing to the villagers. His body would lie here in state for 10 days. I often wonder, Prince Edward II, who would be declared king very shortly, how he was feeling. My personal beliefs are that he had a love-hate relationship with his father, and that his father was often deeply disappointed in his son's lack of desire to be a king or to follow in his footsteps. I think Edward II's actions of ignoring his dad's wishes, ignoring the wishes of the former king, recently passed, that he had his own agenda. He wanted to do things his way because he turned his army around and he took them south again. He had his favourites. His father was, by contrast, had no real favourites, but he did have a trusted circle of warrior knights and politicians around him. But Edward, forever the astute one, now lay in here, in state, for those 10 days where he would have been groomed as befitted a king, before he would make his final journey south to his resting place in Westminster Abbey. Love him or hate him, Edward forever displayed a spirit of not giving up, a fierce determination to see his ambition through. Edward really believed in royalty, and he did not like challenges to royal authority. He truly believed that he was chosen by God to be king. This youngster in Edward I was a free spirit. His father, King Henry III, and his mother had trouble and went to great lengths controlling him. In the end, only death would control the outcome of Edward I. He breathed his last here at Burgh on Sands. He lay here in state for those to come and pay their respects. And then he headed off into eternity, where the change, the passing of the guard, would go over to his son, who would prove to be a very different king.